You did it again this morning. You pulled a container out of the fridge, popped it in the microwave, and didn't think about it for even a second. Most people don't. Reheating leftovers is one of the most automatic habits in modern life. So automatic that almost nobody stops to ask a simple question. What actually happens inside food the second time it gets hot? Not first time. The second time. Because cooking food once and cooking it twice are not the same chemical event, even though they look identical on your plate. Something changes in between. And for a small number of everyday foods, that something has been studied closely enough by food scientists that it's worth 15 minutes of your attention. This isn't about panic. It's not going to tell you that your fridge is secretly dangerous or that leftovers some hidden threat lurking in your kitchen. Most reheated food is perfectly fine. But there are a handful of specific foods where the science genuinely measurable chemical changes during storage and reheating. Changes tied to processes researchers have been investigating for decades in the context of long-term health. Understanding those processes doesn't require fear. It just requires a little bit of food chemistry, explained clearly without the jargon that usually keeps this information locked inside academic journals instead of your kitchen. Here's what's genuinely interesting about this topic, and it's the reason it deserves more attention than it gets. The foods involved are not junk food. They're not the things your doctor already warns you about. They're rice, chicken, leafy greens, and eggs, foods that show up on nearly every healthy eating list ever published. That's exactly what makes this worth understanding. It's not about avoiding bad food. It's about understanding what happens to good food after it leaves the stove and sits in your fridge for a while, waiting for round two. Before we get to the specific foods, it's worth asking a slightly different question, one that has more to do with psychology than chemistry. Why does this particular gap in knowledge exist at all? Part of the answer is that nutrition education, from childhood onward, almost entirely focuses on selection. Which foods to choose, which to limit, how to balance a plate. Almost none of it addresses time. We're taught what to buy and how to cook it, but almost never what happens to it afterward, once it's sitting in a container on a refrigerator shelf. That blind spot isn't an accident of bad teaching. It's simply that food selection advice is easier to turn into a headline than food storage chemistry. Eat more spinach fits on a poster. Spinach behaves differently after 24 hours in the fridge does not. So an entire category of genuinely useful, well-researched information has quietly slipped through the cracks of public health communication for decades. Let's start with the basic chemistry, because once you understand this part, everything else in this video will make sense instantly. When food is cooked for the first time, heat drives a series of predictable, well-understood reactions. Proteins unfold and reshape themselves. Starches absorb water and swell. Fats melt and redistribute. These are normal, expected transformations, and they're part of why cooked food tastes and feels the way it does. Your body has evolved alongside cooked food for hundreds of thousands of years. This first round of cooking isn't the concern. The concern, where one exists, tends to show up in the gap between the first cooking and the second reheating, specifically what happens to food while it's sitting in storage. During that window, 3 separate biological and chemical processes can quietly get to work, and understanding them gives you a kind of X-ray vision into your own fridge. The first process is oxidation. Fats and proteins exposed to air, even inside a sealed container, slowly react with oxygen over time. This is the same basic chemistry behind an apple slice turning brown or butter going rancid, just happening more subtly and more slowly in cooked meat, fish, or eggs. When that already oxidized food gets reheated, the reaction accelerates, and research in food chemistry has linked fat oxidation to the formation of certain byproducts that scientists continue to study for their potential role in cellular stress over time. The second process involves bacteria, not chemistry in the strictest sense, but biology working alongside it. Cooked food that cools slowly or sits at room temperature creates a window of opportunity for certain hardy microorganisms to multiply. Refrigeration slows this dramatically, but doesn't always eliminate every risk, especially for foods known to carry particularly resilient bacterial species. The third process is about a chemical conversion that happens specifically in vegetables naturally rich in nitrates, foods like spinach, celery, beets, and lettuce. Bacteria that are completely normal and present on plant surfaces can convert those nitrates into nitrites during storage. On their own, nitrites aren't inherently dangerous in the small amounts naturally occurring in vegetables. But under certain heat and chemical conditions, nitrites can go on to form compounds called nitrosamines, a category of compounds that public health agencies, including the World Health Organization, have flagged for further scrutiny based on research into dietary exposure. 3 mechanisms: oxidation, bacterial activity, and nitrate conversion. Keep those 3 ideas in your head, because every food we're about to walk through next back to one or more of them. And the first food on this list is one that almost every single person on the planet has reheated at some point this month: rice. It is, statistically, the most consumed staple food on Earth, feeding more than 3 billion people as a daily calorie source. And an enormous share of the rice eaten worldwide isn't eaten fresh. It's cooked in batches, refrigerated, and reheated, sometimes more than once. This habit is so universal that food safety researchers have studied it more than almost any other reheating scenario. Here's the part that surprises most people. The main concern with reheated rice isn't really about reheating at all. It's about what happens while the rice is cooling and sitting in storage beforehand. Raw rice can naturally carry spores of a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. Cooking kills most of the active bacteria, but the spores can survive the cooking process. If cooked rice is left at room temperature for an extended period, or cools too slowly in the fridge, those surviving spores can germinate and begin producing toxins. And this is the detail that catches people off guard. Some of those toxins are heat stable, meaning reheating the rice thoroughly kills the bacteria itself but does not necessarily neutralize the toxins they've already produced. The toxin can effectively survive the very process meant to make the food safe. Food safety researchers have linked this specific toxin, known as cereulide, to acute gastrointestinal illness in the short term, and some laboratory research has explored its effects on cellular energy production, an area scientists sometimes using the term mitochondrial stress. It's important to be precise here. The well-established, well-documented risk with reheated rice is short-term food poisoning, not a confirmed direct cancer pathway. The longer-term cellular research is still an active and evolving area of study, not a settled conclusion. There's a second, separate consideration with rice, and it applies to starchy foods generally. When starchy foods are cooked at high temperatures, a compound called acrylamide can form, produced when natural sugars react with an amino acid called asparagine. Acrylamide has been classified by international cancer research bodies as a probable human carcinogen based on animal studies and mechanistic research, though real-world dietary exposure levels and their actual impact on human cancer risk remain an area of ongoing scientific investigation, not a settled certainty. Repeated heating of starchy foods can, in some studies, modestly increase acrylamide formation, which is one more reason food safety guidance consistently recommends cooling rice quickly, refrigerating it promptly, and avoiding repeated reheating cycles. So what does responsible handling actually look like? Cook rice in amounts you'll realistically finish. If you do have leftovers, spread the rice out on a wide tray or shallow container right after cooking so it cools faster rather than sitting in a deep pot retaining heat. Refrigerate within about an hour, eat it within a day or two, and reheat it only once, making sure it's heated through evenly rather than left lukewarm in the center. None of this requires giving up rice. It just requires treating the cooling window with a little more respect than most of us currently do. Now let's talk about the protein that fitness enthusiasts, dietitians, and meal preppers everywhere have built entire diets around. Chicken. Lean, high in protein, low in the kind of saturated fat found in fattier cuts of red meat. Chicken has earned its reputation as one of the most reliably recommended proteins in modern nutrition, which is exactly why the way we store and reheat it deserves a closer look, because the concern here isn't about chicken itself. It's about what happens to animal muscle protein, specifically when it's exposed to high heat more than once. When protein-rich foods are cooked, and especially when they're cooked at high temperatures or reheated afterward, a class of compounds called heterocyclic amines can form. These compounds have been studied extensively in nutrition science, largely because they form more readily with certain cooking methods. High direct heat, char, and repeated exposure to heat all tend to increase their formation. Once metabolized by the body, some heterocyclic amines can interact with DNA in ways that researchers have studied for their potential role in mutation, one of the early steps involved in how cancer can begin to develop at a cellular level. Epidemiological research, including large population studies, has associated frequent consumption or repeatedly reheated meat and poultry with somewhat elevated rates of certain digestive cancers, though as with most nutrition epidemiology, these are associations across large populations rather than of direct individual cause and effect, and diet is only one factor among many, including genetics, overall lifestyle, and environmental exposure. This doesn't mean chicken should be avoided. It means the way it's reheated matters more than most people realize. Lower, gentler reheating tends to produce fewer of these compounds than blasting food on high heat until it's scorched at the edges. If you're reheating chicken, using a moderate oven or stovetop setting rather than maximum microwave power, and reheating just once rather than repeatedly, are both simple adjustments grounded in the same research. It's worth pausing here on something almost nobody connects to this topic: portion psychology. A huge share of repeated reheating happens not because people plan to eat leftovers twice, but because they cook in bulk on Sunday with the intention of eating the same chicken across 4 or 5 days. That habit, popularized by meal prep culture as a time-saving, discipline-building strategy, inadvertently increases the number of heating cycles a single piece of protein goes through, especially if portions are reheated, partially eaten, and returned to the fridge before being reheated again later. The fix isn't abandoning meal prep. It's freezing portions you won't eat within 2 or 3 days, rather than leaving them in a repeating fridge-to-microwave cycle, and reheating only the portion you're about to eat rather than the entire batch at once. Which brings us to a food that almost nobody thinks to worry about, because it's usually the vegetable your doctor is actively encouraging you to eat more of. Spinach, along with its nitrate-rich cousins, celery, beets, lettuce, and Swiss chard, sits near the top of almost every list of foods associated with better cardiovascular health. That reputation is well earned. The nitrates naturally present in these vegetables are converted in the body into nitric oxide, a molecule involved in relaxing blood vessels and supporting healthy blood pressure. In their fresh, natural state, these nitrates are genuinely beneficial. The complication arises specifically around storage. Once spinach is cooked and then left to sit, refrigerated for an extended period, naturally occurring bacteria on the plant surface can begin converting some of those nitrates into nitrites. This is chemically similar to a process that happens in cured and processed meats, which is part of why nitrite exposure in food has received so much research attention over the years. When nitrite-containing food is then reheated or later digested, those nitrites can react with amino acids to form nitrosamines, the same compound category flagged earlier in this video, and one that food safety authorities in Europe and elsewhere have specifically addressed in formal dietary guidance around vegetable storage and reheating. There's a real irony here worth sitting with for a moment. Spinach, the problem. Time, problem. A vegetable celebrated across nutrition science for its cardiovascular benefit can, through nothing more than a common storage habit practiced in millions of kitchens every week, undergo a chemical shift that public health researchers consider worth minimizing exposure to. This isn't a reason to stop eating leafy greens. It's a reason to change how you handle the leftovers. The practical guidance that follows from this research is refreshingly simple. Cook leafy greens like spinach, chard, and beet greens in portions you'll eat right away when possible. If you do have leftovers, it's generally considered lower risk to eat them cold within a few hours rather than storing them overnight specifically for reheating later. If you must store them, keeping them in an airtight container and consuming them relatively soon, without a second heating cycle, aligns with current food safety guidance on this specific category of vegetable. There's also a broader, less obvious lesson buried in the spinach example, one that applies well beyond leafy greens. Nutritional value and chemical safety are not the same axis. A food can be extremely nutrient-dense and still behave differently depending on how it's handled after cooking. Most of us were taught to think of foods as fixed categories, permanently healthy or permanently unhealthy, when in reality a food's profile can shift depending on variables that have nothing to do with the food itself in its raw state, how long it sat out, how it cooled, how many times it was reheated, and at what temperature. That's a more nuanced way of thinking about diet than most nutrition content offers, and it's one worth carrying with you well beyond this video. And now, the fourth food, the one that tends to genuinely surprise people because it's a food that nutritionists, doctors, and dietitians recommend almost universally, often specifically because it's considered close to nutritionally on its own. They contain all 9 essential amino acids your body can't produce on its own. They're one of the best natural dietary sources of choline, a nutrient involved in brain and liver function that most people don't get enough of. They provide selenium, an important part of the body's antioxidant defense system, along with lutein and zeaxanthin, 2 compounds specifically associated with eye health. By almost any nutritional measure, eggs are an exceptionally efficient food. The consideration with reheating eggs comes down to their fat content, which is concentrated almost entirely in the yolk. When an egg is cooked, that fat undergoes an initial, expected stage of oxidation, part of the normal cooking process. But when a cooked egg is refrigerated and then reheated, particularly at higher temperatures, that fat can undergo a second, faster round of oxidation. One category of byproduct that has drawn particular scientific interest here is oxysterols, oxidized forms of cholesterol that form specifically when cholesterol-containing foods are heated more than once. Research into oxysterols is an active and genuinely evolving area of food science. Some laboratory and cell-based studies have explored associations between oxysterols and processes like inflammation and oxidative cellular stress. And researchers continue investigating their broader relevance to long-term health. It's worth being precise and honest about where the science currently stands. This remains an area of ongoing research rather than a settled, direct causal link to cancer in humans, and drawing a firm conclusion from early-stage research would overstate what's actually known today. There's a second, more mechanical consideration with reheated eggs, particularly in the microwave. Egg proteins that have already been cooked and then reheated can undergo further structural changes, sometimes forming denser protein structures that are somewhat harder to digest efficiently. This is more of a digestive comfort consideration than a major health concern for most people, but it's part of why texture changes so noticeably when you reheat scrambled eggs versus eating them fresh. That rubbery, slightly tough quality isn't your imagination. It's a visible, physical sign of a chemical process you now understand. None of this means are risky. It means, like the other 3 foods on this list, they're simply better suited to fresh preparation or careful storage than repeated, high-heat reheating. If you're meal prepping hard-boiled eggs, keeping them unpeeled in the fridge and eating them cold is a straightforward way to sidestep the reheating question almost entirely. If you're working with scrambled eggs or an omelet, gentle warming, rather than a full microwave blast, tends to preserve both texture and nutritional quality more effectively. Step back for a second and look at what these four foods actually have in common. Rice, chicken, spinach, and eggs aren't the foods nutrition experts usually warn you about. They're the foods nutrition experts recommend. And that's precisely why this topic matters and why it so rarely gets discussed. Warnings about sugary drinks or ultra-processed snacks are everywhere. Warnings about how you store and reheat the healthiest foods in your kitchen are almost nowhere, despite a real and growing body of food science research examining exactly this question. This isn't a gap in willpower, it's a gap in information. Most people reheating rice for the third time this week, or microwaving chicken on high power, or warming yesterday's spinach, aren't making a careless choice. They're making the only choice available to them, because nobody ever explained that a second round of heat isn't chemically identical to the first. Meal preppers eating the same reheated protein bowl 5 days in a row aren't doing anything wrong by trying to eat healthily and efficiently. They simply haven't had access to the details covered in this video, details that exist in public health guidance and peer-reviewed research, but rarely make it into everyday conversation. There's also a quieter, more universal habit worth naming here, because it applies to every single food on this list and to plenty that aren't. Most kitchens rely almost entirely on sight, smell, and touch to judge whether food is still good, whether it's been reheated once or 5 times. But none of those senses can detect oxidation happening at a molecular level, or a nitrate to nitrite conversion, or the presence of a heat-stable toxin. Food can look, smell, and taste completely normal while having already undergone every single process described in this video. That invisibility is exactly why this information matters. You cannot rely on instinct alone to judge what your leftovers have been through. So here is what the research actually points toward, stripped of hype and stated plainly. Cool food quickly rather than letting it sit out. Refrigerate leftovers promptly, generally within about an hour of cooking. Reheat food only once whenever practical, rather than cycling the same container through the microwave across several days. Favor gentler reheating methods, a moderate oven or stovetop rather than max microwave power for protein-rich foods in particular. And where it's realistic, some foods, especially leafy greens like spinach, are simply better suited to being eaten cold or freshly prepared rather than stored specifically for reheating. A food thermometer, something most households don't own and rarely think about, is actually one of the simplest tools available here. Reheating food gently to a safe internal temperature, rather than guessing based on how hot the container feels in your hand, closes the gap between undercooked leftovers that risk bacterial illness and overheated leftovers that accelerate oxidation and compound formation. It's a $5 tool solving a problem most people don't know they have. None of this requires new equipment, expensive changes, or giving up foods you enjoy. It requires a small shift in how you think about your fridge, treating it less like a pause button and more like a countdown clock. The nutritional value that made rice, chicken, spinach, and eggs worth eating in the first place doesn't disappear the moment they're cooked, but it can shift subtly the longer that food sits and the more times it gets reheated. Understanding that shift doesn't mean living in fear of your leftovers. It means giving yourself the option to make a more informed choice, one meal at a time. There's something worth sitting with here that goes beyond the specific chemistry of rice or spinach or eggs. So much of what we consider healthy eating focuses entirely on what food we choose: protein versus carbs, organic versus conventional, home-cooked versus takeout, while almost completely ignoring what happens to that food after it leaves the pan. We obsess over ingredients and largely ignore timeline. But food isn't a static object. It's a chemical system that keeps changing after the cooking is done, whether we're paying attention or not. Maybe that's the real takeaway here. More than any single fact about nitrates or acrylamide or oxysterols, Health isn't only about which foods make it onto your plate. It's also about the quiet, invisible decisions made in the hours and days between cooking and eating, decisions most of us have never been taught to think about at all. The person reheating rice for the third time this week isn't failing at health. They just never got the information you have now. And what you do with that information tonight, tomorrow, the next time you open the fridge, is entirely up to you.